Homage to the Buddha, the Dhamma, and the Sangha. Blessings of the Triple Gem, Teruvan Saranai. Welcome to another Sutta meditation series, Dhamma live stream. Heartfelt good wishes to anyone who will join today. The title for today's Dhamma session is Noble Retirement. And this is based on the Potaliya Sutta. This is Majjhima Nikāya, Discourse number 54. This is a two-part live stream. The first part today covers the first half of the Buddha's teaching to Potalia, and the second part tomorrow, beginning at the same time, covers the second half of the Buddha's teaching to Potalia. The Dhamma contained in the Potaliya Sutta is really powerful, and it's something that we can use to gradually train, gradually practice, and gradually make progress towards the ultimate goal. What we learn from the Potaliya Sutta is also very helpful towards upcoming Dhamma sessions on the second doorway to nibbāna, which is painful practice with quick realization, or Duccaritavipāka Sutta, and how to develop the four bases of power, so Ādhipateyya. So that's what we'll be examining in a series of live streams next month. So let's begin by paying respects to the Triple Gem. We can bow our heads and Anjali. Homage to the Buddha, homage to the Dhamma, homage to the Noble Sangha. So let's have a quick look at what we will cover in this session. And the first thing is our usual tips and reminders how to get the best out of this session. And then we'll look at an introduction overview of this Potaliya Sutta and why this teaching is important. And then we'll review the Buddha's initial interaction with Potaliya. We'll highlight the differences between worldly retirement versus Potaliya's version of retirement and the Buddha's noble retirement. And then we'll deep dive into 8 things that lead to noble retirement, including short meditations on each. And we'll close the session by sharing the merit and blessings. So tomorrow in part 2, we'll examine and contemplate this teaching to a layperson about how noble retirement can be achieved entirely and in all ways, and that will complete our first reading of this sutta. So how to get the best out of this session? As we usually say, keep an open mind. Be open and attentive to the Buddha's words in this particular discourse, and also to the instructions that the Buddha is giving for today's meditations. Think of each session as an opportunity to ensure that we're establishing the right view. Secondly, be okay with not understanding everything. So whatever you take in this session and are able to practice, maybe that's what's needed right now, and the rest will come later. Remember that we're all learners, that we're here to lean on each other, to make effort towards developing the noble path, and we are walking this path together. And apply ourselves to this meditation, that really give ourselves the opportunity to practice, to contemplate during this session, as you hear, but also when we need to do some contemplations ourselves. So use your own examples. And this is the way, as we've said, to connect with the Dhamma. We need to see it directly for ourselves. So from our own experience, if we connect with the Dhamma, that's how we gain direct insight. When we see the Dhamma, we see Buddha, and vice versa. And let's have good wishes for everyone, those who are online right now, but also anyone who has helped us on the spiritual path up to this point. The Potaliya Sutta is without a doubt one of the most powerful teachings the Buddha has given to a layperson or householder. People often say the Buddha only taught lay people and householders Dhamma that was primarily focused on generosity, virtue, such as keeping the 5 precepts, and just a little meditation. Or they say the Buddha gave lay people or householders only gradual teachings on generosity, virtue, the heavenly realms, danger in sensual pleasures, renunciation, and then very light teachings on the Four Noble Truths. And as a result of that, these people conclude that the Buddha didn't encourage lay people or householders towards attainment or the realization of complete liberation. The Potaliya Sutta is one clear example that refutes this view, because the Buddha certainly shows Potaliya in a very powerful and detailed teaching, as we shall see, a direct way of generating the Noble Eightfold Path that leads to the cutting off of all worldly affairs, or the complete elimination of all worldly dealings. In Pali, the Buddha uses the phrase sabbe vohara samuccina, which we can refer to as noble retirement, also known as nibbāna. And he also teaches Potaliya how to achieve this entirely and in all ways, so complete liberation. So this is a very good sutta to study for any lay practitioners who are serious about developing towards the ultimate goal. And of course, it can also be helpful to monastics as well. The instructions in this particular sutta make it possible, like other teachings of the Buddha, to follow the insight pathways as a series of sutta meditations. The short meditations we'll do today will be helpful towards tomorrow's contemplations, which get a little bit more complex, and that's where we bring it all together. As we shall see from delving into this particular teaching, Potaliya is already on the path of renunciation, but he demonstrates at the beginning a level of conceit that he is on equal footing with the Buddha, just by way of how he addresses the Buddha and speaks with him. And in order to understand the error in his ways, we'll look at the differences between different forms of retirement. So it's our very good fortune that this teaching is available to us. We can learn much, including how to practice these teachings that lead to and culminate in the ultimate goal. If anything, it confirms the Buddha's path to liberation is a wisdom path, a path of renunciation, founded on good conduct by body, speech, and mind, and giving up misconduct by body, speech, and mind. So this is the general architecture for the sutta. You could say it's broken into 4 parts. So the first part is the initial meeting, and the Buddha calling Potaliya a householder, and Potaliya getting upset and angry about that, and then defining what retirement means for Potaliya. And then the Buddha responds by saying, well, it's different from what the Buddha would define as retirement. The second part is where Potaliya actually asks the Buddha to explain what this means. And the Buddha goes through 8 things in his dispensation or discipline that lead to retirement and the cutting off of worldly affairs. And he says it in brief, and then he says it in detail when Potaliya asks him out of compassion to actually instruct him. So that's where we'll get to for today's session. And then tomorrow is the second half, which is after explaining that, the Buddha says to Potaliya that that's not achieving noble retirement completely, as in entirely and in all ways, is what the Buddha says. So Potaliya again invites the Buddha to instruct him. And the Buddha uses 7 very powerful, strong, what I call strong medicine, which is usually given to the monks when it comes to sensual pleasures. And he expounds the Dhamma on that. And then the very last part is, as a result of that, the 3 knowledges are developed, which we've seen before in other suttas. And then the Buddha asks Potaliya if he can see in himself these qualities of noble retirement, and has it been achieved entirely and in all ways. And of course, Potaliya answers very humbly and praises the Buddha for the teaching and says that he hasn't, and he takes refuge in the Triple Gem. So we'll cover that second half tomorrow. So just generally, why is this sutta important? And there are some reasons, and we've alluded to them already. So the first is that it's a powerful teaching to a lay person, showing that it's possible for us to develop towards nibbāna and how to achieve it completely. The second is that we can investigate these differences between retirement, because we would have our own views, similar to Potaliya, about retirement and what it means and what is the ultimate goal of it. Thirdly, we can train in the development of the body, virtue, mind, and wisdom with the Noble Eightfold Path. In this series of 8 things, the Buddha is giving a particular method. It's different from what's been seen before, but it lines up as well. And this helps us to activate and generate the Noble Eightfold Path. It also helps us to develop real understanding, to see how sensual pleasures are a major obstacle to noble retirement, and particularly for householders. And we've looked at different suttas that point in this direction as well. But in this particular sutta, there's stronger medicine. And so when you look at what we're going to do tomorrow, which is to contemplate in a much stronger sense the Buddha's similes in this Potaliya Sutta, it's really because these similes on sensual pleasures, they help us to overcome sensual pleasures and enter into the jhanas. And so this is one method that the Buddha uses in order to be secluded from sensual pleasures, be secluded from unwholesome states. And finally, another reason is because it aids the development of the 37 factors of enlightenment, or enlightenment factors, so the Bodhipakya Dhammas, of which Noble Eightfold Path is one part, and then also particularly the Ādhipadas, the basis of power, because these developments of body, virtue, mind, and wisdom are what underpin the 4 bases of power. So let's now examine the sutta and begin with how Potaliya meets the Buddha and what unfolds. So the discourse begins, "Thus have I heard on one occasion the Blessed One was living in the country of the Anguttarapans, where there was a town of theirs named Apana. Then, when it was morning, the Blessed One dressed, and taking his bowl and outer robe, went into Apana for alms. When he had wandered for alms in Apana and had returned from his alms round, after his meal he went to a certain grove, and had returned from his alms round. After his meal he went to a certain grove for the day's abiding. Having entered the grove, he sat down at the root of a tree. Potaliya the householder, while walking and wandering for exercise, wearing full dress with parasol and sandals, also went to the grove. And having entered the grove, he went to the Blessed One, and exchanged greetings with him. When this courteous and amiable talk was finished, he stood at one side. The Blessed One said to him, 'There are seats, householder, sit down if you like.' When this was said, the householder, Potaliya, thought, 'The recluse Gautama addresses me as a householder,' and angry and displeased, he remained silent. A second time, the Blessed One said to him, 'There are seats, householder, sit down if you like.' And a second time, the householder, Potaliya, thought, 'The recluse Gautama addresses me as a householder,' and angry and displeased, he remained silent. A third time, the Blessed One said to him, 'There are seats, householder, sit down if you like.' When this was said, the householder, Potaliya, thought, 'The recluse Gautama addresses me as householder,' and angry and displeased, he said to the Blessed One, 'Master Gautama, it is neither fitting nor proper that you address me as a householder.' As we can see, Potaliya meets the Buddha, they exchange polite greetings, but when he's addressed by the Buddha as householder, Potaliya gets offended, seriously offended, because he becomes angry and displeased. The Pali word here is gahapati, which has been translated as householder, but it can also be translated as master of a house or house lord. Essentially what it means is someone who lives a household life, not a renunciant life. From this interaction, what we can see is that Potaliya believes himself not to be a householder, so that's why he gets angry at being addressed that way. And he eventually says to the Buddha, it's not fitting or proper to address him as a householder. Now, although Potaliya addresses the Buddha politely as the recluse Gautama or Master Gautama, this form of address is not giving respect to the Buddha as a fully enlightened being. So we can infer from this early interaction that Potaliya has some conceit, some kind of mana, that he is on equal footing with the Buddha, or maybe even atimana if he thinks he's better. And as we shall see in a little bit, once Potaliya realizes his mistake, he corrects himself and thereafter refers to the Buddha as Venerable Sir and the Blessed One. Now, in response to Potaliya's anger and displeasure, the Buddha says to him, "Householder, you have the aspects, marks, and signs of a householder." And the Pali here is akara, te linga, te nimitta, yata tang gahapatissa. So akara means, or is translated as condition, state, or appearance, and linga is translated as mark or feature or attribute. Nimitta means sign or outward appearance. So the Pali describing Potaliya's appearance at the start of this sutta, sampana nivāsana pavurano chattu pahanahi. So that's been translated as wearing full dress with parasol and sandals. And it can also be translated as he's very well dressed or completely attired with both the undergarment and the outer garment and a parasol and sandals. So for all intents and purposes, Potaliya looks like a very prosperous and affluent layperson. So we can see why the Buddha took in Potaliya's appearance, and all the signs and features indicated that of a householder, not a renunciant. So Potaliya responds to the Buddha and says, "Nevertheless, Master Gautama, I have given up all my works and cut off all my worldly affairs." And this is Potaliya's way of saying that he's rejected or retired from all his work or activities, so sabbe, kamanta, patikitta, and he's completely eliminated or cut off all his business or worldly dealings, so sabbe vohara samuchina. The Buddha, of course, questions him and still calls him householder, and he says, "In what way, householder, have you given up all your works and cut off all your worldly affairs?" And Potaliya still replies with conceit, because he's addressing the Buddha still as Master Gautama. He says, "Master Gautama, I have given all my wealth, grain, silver, and gold to my children as their inheritance. I do not advise or blame them about such matters, but merely live on food and clothing. That is how I've given up all my works and cut off all my worldly affairs." What we can understand from this statement, or Potaliya's answer, is that he believes, having given up all his wealth and property to his children, and he doesn't advise or blame them in regard to those things, and he only receives support for food and clothing, this fulfills retirement, his retirement and his cutting off of his worldly dealings, and by which he probably reasons that he's a renunciant, similar to the Buddha. Now, compared to most people, Potaliya has renunciated a lot. I mean, if you think, how many people do we know who have retired in a worldly sense, have relinquished all their property to their children while they're still alive? Or, having done so, how many would actually give up control without advising or directing or blaming in regard to that very same wealth or property or business? And how many, after a lifetime of independence, would choose to make themselves dependent on their children for ongoing support? So the answer really is not many people today would be able to do that. So when we look at retirement in the conventional or worldly sense, it's usually spoken of in terms of looking forward to accessing one's nest egg, having more time for sensual enjoyment, going on a world trip, feeling as if one deserves to indulge in sensual pleasures after a lifetime of hard work, paying taxes, raising a family, guarding one's property, getting into a variety of legal disputes and more. The problem with this scenario, this conventional retirement, is one doesn't see the danger in sensual pleasures. One doesn't address the origin of suffering, which is craving, and the process needed to unravel how we take delight, welcome, and remain holding. And there's no questioning of what happens next. What we don't realize about conventional retirement and allowing ourselves to become imbued with sensual pleasures as some kind of reward for living a life is that the outcome at the end of it all, in terms of the bigger picture that the Buddha speaks of, is risky. If one hasn't applied to truly understanding our collective predicament in this magnitude of samsara, then the chances of failing the ultimate test, like the final test at the point of death with the breakup of this body, is high. This is because we haven't established right view. And that means it's not leading to the right path. Without the right view, we continue with the wrong view and the wrong path. And we wouldn't understand that we are the owners of our karma, heirs to our karma. So if no effort is made towards wholesome actions by body, speech, and mind, developing the Noble Eightfold Path, then we would expect an unhappy destination, an unhappy outcome. Now, if we turn back to Potalia, as we highlighted earlier, he's renunciated quite a lot compared to most people. You could even say what he's done is what most people are unable to do, and only what they do after they've passed away. So Potalia, from a conventional point of view, he may have, some opinion that he's got a leg to stand on compared to average householders. So the question for us to ask here is, do we have similar ideas to Potalia? Or are we knowingly or unknowingly conceited about our spiritual practice or the way we lead the spiritual life, having given up some things? And so, for example, we might think, I've been practicing Dhamma for 10 years, 20 years, 30 years or more, so I should be respected and addressed with respect. Or we may have retired or semi-retired at whatever age and given up most of our worldly dealings, keeping them to a minimum, and we think, I've given up so much. I'm living a minimalist lay life. I'm keeping precepts for many, many years, so I'm like a household monk or nun. And so I should be considered equivalent to someone ordained, and most especially compared to those who break the Vinaya. So there's also conceit with that. And maybe we might think, my practice is good. I've been sharing Dhamma as a lay teacher for so many years, and I've got plenty of students, and so many people respect me like they would a monastic. So again, whatever the case may be, it's good to investigate and see if there's some conceit about spiritual practice or spiritual life, because if that's the case, we need to recognize that it would obstruct us from connecting with the Buddha's teaching in this particular sutta, and also block us from developing the Noble Eightfold Path correctly. So just take a few moments just to ponder that. Now, this next part is about noble retirement in brief. And this is the Buddha's response to Potaliya's explanation. So the Buddha says, householder, the cutting off of affairs, as you describe it, is one thing. But in the Noble One's discipline, the cutting off of worldly affairs is different. So in this response, the Buddha is saying that Potaliya has described something different. So in Pali, the Noble One's discipline is Ariyasa Vinaya, and it's also, you could say, training of the Noble Ones. And so Potaliya responds by asking, what is the cutting off of worldly affairs like in the Noble One's discipline, Venerable Sir? It would be good, Venerable Sir, if the Blessed One would teach me the Dhamma, showing what the cutting off of worldly affairs is like in the Noble One's discipline. Here, Potaliya is no longer addressing the Buddha as Master Gautama, but using Venerable Sir as well as the Blessed One. So he has, in a very short time, come to realize that the Buddha is worthy of respect. And fortunately for Potaliya, he's willing to be instructed, he's suvacha to the Buddha in this moment. So the Buddha says, then listen, householder, and attend closely to what I shall say. Yes, Venerable Sir, Potaliya the householder replied. So the Buddha is now going to help us to see what it really means to cut off worldly affairs in the supramundane or noble sense, what we refer to as noble retirement or nibbāna. And it goes far beyond the conventional retirement or giving up of work and adopting maybe a change in lifestyle still imbued with sensual pleasures. And it is also more than the renunciation adopted by Potaliya, in which he gave away all his wealth and property and interests in worldly affairs. So in this part of his teaching to Potaliya, the Buddha gives instructions on a way to develop the Noble Eightfold Path that leads to noble retirement. And the Buddha says, householder, there are these 8 things in the Noble One's discipline that lead to the cutting off of worldly affairs. What are the 8? With the support of the non-killing of living beings, the killing of living beings is to be abandoned. Apanatipatang nisaya panatipato pahatabo. So nisaya here has been translated as with the support, and it can also be translated as by means of, or for the purpose of, or relying on, or by way of. So for each of these 8 things, a wholesome action is developed in order for the unwholesome one to be abandoned. So if we think about how we continue to transmigrate in samsara, what the Buddha teaches us, even how we come to this present birth, it is due to unwholesome actions. So our misconduct by body, speech and mind, rooted in greed, hatred and delusion, that makes it happen. So the Buddha is telling us these 8 unwholesome things are preventing us from noble retirement. So if we take up these 8 wholesome things to abandon the 8 unwholesome ones, the misconduct, then this is the way to go. So if we keep doing unwholesome things like misconduct, then we can't develop the Noble Eightfold Path. We can't realize noble retirement. So for this first one, by making effort towards non-killing, killing is abandoned in order to develop the Noble Eightfold Path. And then the second one, the Buddha says, with the support of taking only what is given, the taking of what is not given is to be abandoned. So dina dana nisaya adina dana pahatabam. So here, by making effort towards taking only what is given, then the taking of what is not given, so sometimes we refer to this as stealing, is abandoned in order to develop the Noble Eightfold Path. So you can see we are doing this because we want to develop the Noble Eightfold Path. This is the reason. The third one is with the support of truthful speech. False speech is to be abandoned. So satcha vachang nisaya musavado pahatabo. So by making effort towards truthful speech, we abandon false speech, in other words, lying, in order to develop this Noble Eightfold Path. And then the fourth one is with the support of non-divisive speech. Divisive speech is to be abandoned. In Pali, apisuna vachang nisaya pisuna vacha pahatabati. So when we make effort towards non-divisive speech, divisive speech is abandoned in order to develop the Noble Eightfold Path. So pisuna vacha is also translated as slander or malicious speech, but for this session I'll be using the translation of divisive speech. And then the fifth one is with the support of no greed and covetousness. Greed and covetousness are to be abandoned. So agidiloba nisaya gidilobo pahataboti. So by making effort not to have greed and covetousness is abandoned in order to develop the Noble Eightfold Path. So giriloba is also translated as rapacity and greed, or rapacity and greed, I'm not sure how that's pronounced, or greed and lust. In this session, I'll be using greed and covetousness for giriloba. And then the sixth one is with the support of not insulting with anger. Insulting with anger are to be abandoned. So anindarosang nisaya nindaroso pahataboti. So by making effort towards not insulting with anger is abandoned, so we can develop the Noble Eightfold Path. So nindarosa is also translated as spite and scolding, but I don't think that's sufficient. And also blaming and insulting, which is close but also a little bit misleading. So in this session, I'll be using insulting with anger for nindarosa, and it'll become a little clearer over the next couple of days, sessions. And then the seventh one is with the support of non-affliction with anger. Affliction with anger are to be abandoned. So akodupayasang nisaya kodupayaso pahatabo. Now, by making effort towards non-affliction, affliction with anger is abandoned, so we can develop the Noble Eightfold Path. So koda upayasa, it's also translated as anger and irritation, or associated with anger, or anger and distress. It doesn't really matter what we use for this, because the meaning behind it is probably more important, but for this purpose we'll call it affliction with anger. And then the last one is with support of non-arrogance. Arrogance is to be abandoned. So anatimanang nisaya atimano pahatabo. By making effort towards non-arrogance, arrogance is abandoned in order to develop the Noble Eightfold Path. So arrogance, as we said earlier, is a form of conceit. the conceit that we believe we're superior or better compared to others. And so with these 8 things, the Buddha says, these are the 8 things stated in brief without being expounded in detail that lead to the cutting off of worldly affairs in the Noble One's discipline. So a little earlier we highlighted that Potalia had some kind of conceit regarding how he renunciated the world. And so Potalia can probably see what he's done is not enough after listening to these 8 things. And what is really interesting about these 8 things is seeing that the 8th one, so arrogance or conceit, that one is superior or better, this has a very strong relationship to these other unwholesome things, this misconduct that the Buddha is pointing to. So let me explain that a little bit. When it comes to killing living beings, those who kill develop an arrogance or conceit that either it is good to kill or it's okay to kill in certain scenarios. And this applies whether one is a butcher, a hunter, someone who's in the military, a criminal, or even someone who kills in self-defense, or even someone who kills by accident. But there can be an arrogance around someone's skill at killing as well. So what this boils down to is an arrogance associated with living with hate. And then the second thing, like when it comes to taking what is not given, stealing, again, people who steal have a conceit about their skill or ability to steal, to be able to take something which is not theirs. Like even when you think about corruption and being able to do things without anyone finding out, or a criminal who gets very challenged by certain difficult things and being able to steal them. I mean, what this boils down to is an arrogance associated with living with greed, even in this conventional sense. But later on, we're going to go into the supramundane path and what stealing really means. And then when it comes to false speech, lying, we become conceited or arrogant about worldly things, and we speak on them as if they're the truth. And we need to see that this is associated with living with greed. In the supramundane sense, it's all lies because these lies keep us bound to samsara and more suffering. And on the supramundane path, only beneficial talk, which is undeceptive and leads to this noble retirement, nibbāna, is what the Buddha considers the truth. The fourth, when we think about divisive speech, there's also an arrogance or conceit that we think it's fine to have this kind of speech. And when you look at the world and how it's imbued with divisive speech, and what we mean by this is to divide, to exclude, to separate, to cause disharmony where there may be harmony or unity. And in the world, it's growing every day. And in the supramundane path, we need to see that it's associated with living with hate. So when there is also greed and covetousness, we don't see the danger in sensual pleasures. We become arrogant and conceited. And this is largely conditioned by the world and how we've come into the world to think and believe that greed is good, that pleasure arises with greed. And so living with greed means we're bound to this whole mass of suffering. And then with insulting with anger, out of arrogance or conceit, we manifest certain actions due to spite or contempt for others. We borrow, we get into debt, all these things associated with sensual things in order to directly or indirectly insult with anger. And we'll go more into this as we go along. It's associated with living with all of the three, greed, hatred, and delusion. And then the last one, which is being afflicted with anger, we keep trying to sustain this life, like sustain our constructions, despite the fact that they keep breaking. Because our predicament, when we are born, we are subject to old age, sickness, and death. So out of arrogance and conceit, we keep thinking we're in control. We can make things last. And this is essentially associated with living with hate and also delusion. So you can see that conceit, of which arrogance is the conceit that one is superior, this is one of the higher fetters that is given up at the point of complete liberation. And it's interesting that the Buddha has it in this list and is really highlighting it, and you can see how it starts to hang together with the other kinds of misconduct. And so if it's only given up at complete liberation, that means it's only given up when one realizes the fruit of arahantship. So it's a very insidious, unwholesome mental state to overcome. In contemplating the Potaliya Sutta, we have the opportunity to look deeper into this close relationship between conceit and misconduct. So in Pali, misconduct is this dusila, this immorality. And this can be very beneficial for all of us towards making spiritual progress. And what we see out of conceit or arrogance, we undertake these 7 unwholesome actions of misconduct by body, speech, and mind. So conceit says something along the lines of, oh, it's good to be like this, or it's better this way to kill, steal, lie, and so on. And the perception or sense of permanent self is really activated with this, and conceit is the one that is assigning value to it. Likewise, when we see that we have these unwholesome actions, they end up breeding more conceit, because you start to think, oh, I can get away with it, or I'm really good at this type of misconduct by body, speech, and mind. So what we can infer is, if we cut off or abandon misconduct by body, speech, and mind that the Buddha is showing with these 7 things, it helps us to overcome conceit or arrogance. Now, this may not hit you straight away, but this is a really powerful insight, because if we can truly see this, it actually helps us to practice this Dhamma. We've previously spoken about how the Buddha was known as the fully developed one, so bhavitatto in Pali, meaning he had fully developed the 37 enlightenment factors, and in developing the Noble Eightfold Path, the Buddha had fully developed the body, so bhavatakaya, and developed virtue, bhavata sila, developed the mind, bhavata citta, and also developed wisdom, bhavata panya. So you can see that on this particular slide. And this is stated in Cūḷaniddesa, so this is Venerable Sariputta's explanation. And if we also go to the Potaliya, and this has been spoken about when we were looking at the Four Noble Truths, one of the talks, I think it was 2 years ago. And in the Potaliya, in reference to these developments, it says the development of body is by right action and right livelihood. The development of virtue is by right speech and right effort. The development of mind is by right intention and right concentration. And the development of wisdom is by right view and right mindfulness. So with this fourfold development, 2 ideas come to fulfillment through the development of mind and wisdom. So samatha, calm, is developed through the development of mind, so the bhavata citta. And vipassana, which is insight, is developed through bhavata panya, the development of wisdom. So when we even meditate and develop this Noble Eightfold Path using the instructions of the Buddha in Potaliya Sutta, and of course it applies to other suttas where the Buddha is generating the Noble Eightfold Path, this is what we are developing. So these 8 things the Buddha is teaching Potaliya is similarly connected to developing the body, virtue, mind, and wisdom, and the Noble Eightfold Path. So, non-killing of living beings and taking what is given, only taking what is given, are part of developing the body. So bhavata kaya. And then truthful speech and non-divisive speech are part of developing virtue, bhavata sila. And non-greed and covetousness and not insulting with anger are part of developing the mind, bhavata citta. And non-affliction with anger and non-arrogance can be seen as part of developing wisdom, so bhavata panya. So when these are developed, what the Buddha says is we attain to concentration due to desire, so chanda samadhi, concentration due to mind, chitta samadhi, concentration due to effort, virya samadhi, and concentration due to investigation, vimamsa samadhi. Now, why is this helpful? This is helpful towards developing the 4 bases of power, so the Ādhipateyas, and also the 4 modes of practice. These are inputs into that, the different patipadas. And so this is also very, very powerful stuff when you start to put these things together. So after receiving the teaching in brief, Potaliya then asks, Venerable Sir, it would be good if out of compassion the Blessed One would expound to me in detail these 8 things that lead to the cutting off of worldly affairs in the Noble One's discipline, which have been stated in brief by the Blessed One without being expounded in detail. And the Buddha replies, Then listen, householder, and attend closely to what I shall say. And yes, Venerable Sir, Potaliya the householder replied. So we can now look at each of the 8 things in the Noble One's discipline. that leads to noble retirement in more detail. So the first one is this. The Blessed One said this: with the support of non-killing of living beings, the killing of living beings is to be abandoned. So it was said. And with reference to what was this said? Here a noble disciple considers thus: I am practicing the way to the abandoning and cutting off of those fetters, because of which I might kill living beings. If I were to kill living beings, I would blame myself for doing so. The wise, having investigated, would censure me for doing so, and on the dissolution of the body after death, because of killing living beings, an unhappy destination would be expected. But this killing of living beings is itself a fetter and a hindrance, and while taints, vexation, and fever might arise through the killing of living beings, there are no taints, vexation, and fever for one who abstains from killing living beings. So it is with reference to this that it was said, with the support of the non-killing of living beings, the killing of living beings is to be abandoned. So what is the Buddha teaching us here? We can see that the Buddha wants us to reflect on what we practice non-killing of living beings. And what he says is, I am practicing the way to the abandoning and cutting off of those fetters. So the Buddha refers to this misconduct of killing as a fetter, so a sangyojana. And what it really means is that it keeps us in bondage to continue transmigrating in samsara. The Buddha is reminding us to reflect on the importance of cutting off this fetter, to abandon the misconduct, in this case, killing living beings. Why? Well, to practice the way. So in Pali, the word is patipanno, and that can also be translated as entering upon a path or a course or following a method. So what is this path or course that we are practicing? Of course, it's the Noble Eightfold Path. So it is because we are practicing the Noble Eightfold Path that we wish to abstain from killing living beings, because it's an unwholesome physical action. So we know this is part of Aryakanta Sila, like these are virtues dear to the Noble Ones. And so the Noble Eightfold Path leads with right view, and when we have established right view, then right intention follows. So in this case, if we cultivate non-ill will thinking, Ādhipateyya, so that means this is rooted in non-hate, then we would abandon killing, which is rooted in hate. So by practicing non-killing, we start to develop the body, this bhavatakaya. If we don't abandon killing, of course, what does the Buddha say? We would be obstructed from this path. So this is the bit that is the hindrance that Buddha is referring to. So we wouldn't be able to follow this path leading to noble retirement. And when the Buddha says that we would blame ourselves, and the wise, having investigated, would censure us, and on dissolution of the body, an unhappy destination can be expected, we really need to look at this quite closely, because when we don't have the good quality of hiri, like moral shame, because that's one of the protectors on the path, when that kicks in, that's when we start to think, oh, maybe I shouldn't have done that, or maybe I shouldn't do that. And particularly with things in the past, we would have remorse over them when we have this moral shame. And you just have to think about some examples like policemen or soldiers, and they'll tell you that they don't sleep well if they're killed, that they have nightmares and other mental ailments. And it also happens to people who their skill or their job involves killing, like butchers and fishermen and things like that. They often turn to drugs, alcohol, and other things to numb the pain or the guilt, and it may not even be conscious. And there is also fear of being shunned for killing, that it's not really something that is acceptable. And also the fear of punishment if you've done something quite wrong. And of course, those are the things that would eventually haunt you. And then when it comes to the wise censuring us, anyone with right view would not condone the killing of living beings. So that's one form of censure. And for example, if you work in a particular job that involves killing, that's not really something that parents usually say, oh, go and pursue that trade or that profession. So they wouldn't, like a parent wouldn't condone necessarily, particularly in a Buddhist country, for their child to become a butcher or a fisherman. They'd say, go and study accounting or go and do something else. And likewise, if a parent were to find out that their child is an assassin, again, the same thing. So again, there's more to it. There's this sutta called the Ādhipateyya Sutta, and the Buddha utters these verses, and this is Anguttara Nikāya. And he says, for one performing an evil deed, there is no place in the world called hidden. The self within you knows, O person, whether it is true or false. Indeed, sir, you the witness despise your good self. You conceal the evil self existing within yourself. The Devas and Tathagatas see the fool acting unrighteously in the world. So this is a reminder to remember that nothing is hidden in the world. So it's not something for us to be alarmed about, but something to bear in mind as a way of wanting to exert effort to abandon unwholesome actions. And because we also don't want to be considered foolish by wise beings. And we remember that like goes with like. So if we have good conduct, we are like the Devas, we are like the noble ones in the pure abodes, we're like the Tathagatas. And then the last part of the contemplation is really about after death an unhappy destination would be expected. So if we have the good seika quality of fear of wrongdoing, so in Pali this is ottappa, then again that's a protector for the path, because if that kicks in, then we would think, oh, well, with right view, there are consequences for our actions, and we are the owners and heirs of our actions, owners of our karma. And if we repeatedly pursue and develop and cultivate destruction of life, the Buddha says in the Duccaritavipāka Sutta, and we've referred to this many times, that it's conducive to hell, to the animal realm, and to the sphere of the afflicted spirits. But if you're reborn as a human being, then at a minimum, it conduces to a short lifespan. So when you look at these things that the Buddha is encouraging as part of this practice, it's good to remember that they're there to prevent us from making unwholesome action. So in this case, killing living beings. And it's good to see that it's a blessing to refrain, that there is happiness associated with restraint. It's a sukha bhagya dhamma, like it's associated with happiness. And to understand the reasons why we want to stay on this wholesome path. And so the other part that the Buddha says, really, when he says that killing living beings is a fetter, a hindrance, but he also says that it's a taint, it's distress, and that there's a fever that arises through the killing of living beings. What you really want to see here is that there's so much trouble that is coming to the mind, and there's so much more trouble to come. And so when we become fettered to unwholesome actions, we're bound for misery, bound for distress, bound to be reborn to the lower realms, or a short lifespan if we're fortunate enough to be reborn as a human. And you need to think that being born as a human with that kind of karmic balance, you could be born in a war-torn area or subject to an early death for whatever reason. So abstaining from killing living beings, well, we wouldn't expect to be reborn in an unhappy destination, and we wouldn't experience all these troubles and distress in this particular life as well. So it's really good to do a little meditation, just a short one, to really contemplate. So the one we're looking at is, with the support of non-killing of living beings, the killing of living beings is to be abandoned. So don't just gloss over this. Really investigate. Take a closer look. Don't just think, oh no, I don't kill. This is something I need to focus on. Part of being born into our present human birth, we need to acknowledge that there's a likelihood that we have killed living beings in the past. And the Buddha keeps telling us we're the owners of our karma, heirs to our karma. So as a number of prompts to look at whether we kill living beings, or we have, the question to ask is, do we spray insects with bug spray, or do we whack cockroaches and things like that when we see them? Do we poison or kill animals or humans? Do we dig the ground or use machinery or equipment that would kill creatures that live in the soil or live in the forest? And if we have a job, do we kill as part of our job? So you think butcher, fisherman, abattoir worker, soldier, executioner, assassin. Or do we kill for entertainment? So is there shooting or hunting wild animals or recreational fishing? Or have we killed in self-defense? Or have we killed when we're intoxicated? So these are a few examples, and if something does come to mind, the important thing is to admit the transgression right now, to make amends right now, and to see that killing obstructs us from practicing the Noble Eightfold Path. We end up blaming ourselves when we know this good Dhamma. We're censured by the wise, and we can expect an unhappy destination. So when we genuinely make this connection, just like we do with the Karaniya Metta, we make a strong determination to abstain from killing. And this is to practice the Noble Eightfold Path and to abandon killing. So the idea is not to worry, but to actually make the strong determination, because we want to develop the body, this bhavatakaya. And so when we do so in this meditation, we're blameless. The wise would praise us and we wouldn't have any troubles or distress. So let's do this meditation just for a few minutes, just to take this Dhamma into our minds. Okay, blessings of the Triple Gem. Okay, we can come out of the meditation, so only just a little short time. So let's now look at the second thing. So the Buddha says, with the support of taking only what is given, the taking of what is not given is to be abandoned. So it was said, and with reference to what was this said? And the Buddha repeats the same things as before, that we are practicing the way to abandon and cut off those fetters because of which I might take what is not given. If I were to take what is not given, I would blame myself for doing so. The wise, having investigated, would censure me for doing so. And on the dissolution of the body after death, because of taking what is not given, an unhappy destination would be expected. And so the Buddha goes on to say, but this taking of what is not given is itself a fetter and a hindrance. And while taints, vexation, and fever might arise through the taking of what is not given, there are no taints, vexation, and fever for one who abstains from taking what is not given. And so it is reference to this, that it was said, with the support of taking only what is given, the taking of what is not given is to be abandoned. So again, what is the Buddha teaching us here? Again, it's because we're practicing the Noble Eightfold Path that we wish to abstain from taking what is not given, abstain from stealing, because that's an unwholesome physical action. So again, this is part of Aryakanta Sila, virtues dear to the noble ones. And like we said before, Noble Eightfold Path leads with right view. And of course, right intention follows that. So in this case, with the taking what is not given, if we have thoughts of renunciation, so nibbāna, that this is rooted in non-greed, then we would abandon taking what is not given, which is rooted in greed. So we can't develop the Noble Eightfold Path leading to noble retirement if we keep stealing. Now, taking only what is given is developing the body, so this bhavitakaya. So with the non-killing and the taking only what is given, we develop this bhavitakaya. So in the conventional world, stealing or taking what is not given means taking something that doesn't belong to us, so something without permission. So often we think of burglaries, shoplifting, career criminals, stealing for some kind of dishonest personal gain. But the Buddha expands this particular taking what is not given to develop the supramundane path, so the Noble Eightfold Path. So if you look at what the Buddha considers as one who truly fulfills supramundane right livelihood, it is a monk or a nun who lives by collecting alms food, so pindapata, bhikkhu or bhikkhuni. And they are the only ones that are living without greed. They're developing the non-greed path by taking only what is given. So they're not scheming or thinking about holding on to things, even in their minds, around property, wealth, etc. And everyone else, like particularly householders, we are living with greed by means of wrong livelihood. So it's a very powerful one when you really take this one in. In the Mahācattārīsaka Sutta, so Majjhima Nikaya, discourse number 117, we looked at this as part of looking at how do we get to noble right concentration. And the Buddha says that wrong livelihood is scheming, prattling, hinting, tricking, pursuing gain with gain, coveting. And this is what equates to taking what is not given in the supramundane sense, because it doesn't fulfill supramundane right livelihood. Each of us, whether we're a householder or monastic, really needs to look at this in order to develop the Noble Eightfold Path, because this is what obstructs being able to fulfill bhavitakaya. Now, for householders in our contemplation, of course, we know we need to go out to work and earn money, and we store it and we live off savings and things like that. So what we do is we need to admit that we fall short, that we acknowledge that by going to work and earning money, pursuing gain and living off assets and so on, we're living with greed and taking what is not given in the supramundane path. Now, when the Buddha set up the monastic order, it was to enable a swifter progress towards nibbāna, to enable right livelihood. So this is something that's not possible in lay life. And when there is right livelihood, there are less obstructions to the development of the Noble Eightfold Path, particularly development of the body, bhavitakaya. So the Buddha says that if we were to take what is not given, then we would blame ourselves and the wise would censure us and all those things that we went through for the last one on non-killing. So again, we need to really think about remorse over stealing, that if we have this fear, if we steal, of getting caught, of being blamed, and particularly of getting punished, and there are mental afflictions of when we steal, we can't enjoy certain things because of we've taken someone else's pleasure. And also, when one steals, there's a feeling of paranoia that people want to take our things and there's an uneasiness around it. So it's also good to really investigate that. And of course, the same thing, the whys, even in terms of our parents, if they knew that we were shoplifting when we were young, or as a older person that we're corrupt and have done something at work that is taking what is not given, they would be embarrassed and they would feel a lot of shame around that. And so the whys you can see in a conventional sense with sentient. Of course, as we said before, the devas and other beings that can know these things, they would also think that we are foolish. And when it comes to an unhappy destination, in the Duccaritavipāka Sutta, again it says it's conducive to the lower realms if we take what is not given. And if we are reborn as a human, it conduces to a loss of wealth. So these are good things to reflect upon to prevent us from taking unwholesome actions, taking what is not given. So again, to see the blessing of restraint and to know that we want to take this up in order to develop the noble path. And so again, the same thing, that all that comes of this kind of misconduct is troubles, that we are troubled, we are tainted, we are distressed, and we undergo a kind of fever around these things. And what really we can expect is that even if we are to undertake stealing, the loss of wealth in future lifetimes could be through natural disaster, it could be living in a place where we get burgled, all kinds of things. And so it's really important to say, okay, I want to abstain from taking what is not given. So in terms of the meditation, we can do another short meditation looking at this, that by taking only what is given as a support, we can abandon taking what is not given. So we need to check and admit if we have done certain things, even in a conventional sense, in this lifetime, and to acknowledge that part of being born again, we have had past actions that entail stealing. So we investigate, maybe, when we're young, did we shoplift? Something that maybe our friends were doing, so we followed along. Or maybe for fun, we ate at a eatery and then ran off without paying. Or maybe we got on public transport without paying, or we took money from someone else's wallet when we were young, or we stole someone else's belonging without telling, without permission. There's even cases where people think it's okay to siphon other people's electricity, like a neighbor's electricity, or steal their Wi-Fi, or to take things from work that haven't been allowed, from stationery to IT equipment to even toilet rolls. And then there's also the larger scale of misappropriating property from work, whether it's the government or a company, or misusing funds where we work. So we need to investigate if there are any examples like this, and to know that it blocks our path, that it's something that will not lead to developing the Noble Eightfold Path, and therefore we cannot realize noble retirement. And also include in the contemplation, if you can, just being able to admit that as householders, we're not able to fulfill the supramundane, taking what is only given. And if we admit this, we don't worry about the fact that we have to go to work tomorrow or the next day. But what we do is we know, for the purposes of meditation, what we're doing right now today, that we want to be able to admit so we can give it up right now and develop the supramundane path, which is this Noble Eightfold Path. And so if we see all that, and we see that refraining means that we are blameless, the wise would praise us rather than censure us, that we can expect a good destination with less troubles or distress, and develop this bhavatakaya, then this is all very good things that help us to walk this path. So let's do this meditation just for another few minutes, just so we take this Dhamma into our minds. Okay, blessings of the Triple Gem. we can come out of the meditation now. Let's now look at the third thing. So the Buddha says, with the support of truthful speech, false speech is to be abandoned. So it was said, and with reference to what was this said, here a noble disciple considers thus, I am practicing the way to the abandoning and cutting off of those fetters because of which I might have false speech. If I were to have false speech, I would blame myself for doing so. The wise, having investigated, would censure me for doing so, and on the dissolution of the body after death because of false speech, an unhappy destination would be expected. But this false speech is itself a fetter and a hindrance, and while taints, vexation, and fever might arise through false speech, there are no taints, vexation, and fever for one who abstains from false speech. So it is with reference to this that it was said, with the support of truthful speech, false speech is to be abandoned. So what is the Buddha teaching us here? He's saying that we are practicing the Noble Eightfold Path, and so we wish to abstain from false speech because it's unwholesome. It's unwholesome verbal action. And we know that this is also Aryakanta Sila, so another virtue that is dear to the noble ones. And again, establishing right view. If we have thoughts of renunciation, which is part of right intention, this is rooted in non-greed, then we would abandon false speech that is rooted in greed. So we can't develop the Noble Eightfold Path if we continue to lie, continue to have false speech. And false speech is associated with wrong speech, and therefore, if we cultivate truthful speech, we are developing virtue, bhavata sila. Now, false speech in the conventional sense is the telling of lies or having false statements, being untruthful. So we need to ensure that we don't have this kind of verbal conduct. And truthful speech in the supramundane sense is associated, or it arises as a result of beneficial talk. And we had a session on that where it includes talk about the fewness of wishes, contentment, seclusion, non-association, arousing energy, virtue, concentration, wisdom, liberation, and the knowledge and vision of liberation. So those were all the things that are leading to noble retirement. So the Buddha encourages us towards this kind of talk to overcome wrong speech, because we would be lying if we were talking about all these other things that are rooted in greed and that basically bond us to the world. And so when the Buddha says in this whole thing, similar to the other ones, we need to really look at whether we would blame ourselves. So you know that feeling when you get caught in a lie, there's a fear around it. There's a fear of being blamed, the fear of being exposed or accused, also to suffer the consequences of lying, and also the mental affliction of trying to keep up with all the lies. And of course, there's also paranoia, and then we become very distrustful of other people as well, and very restless. And then, of course, the wise, nobody really likes anybody who lies and they're found out. Like, you wouldn't really want to trust that person or be around that person or rely on that person. And of course, again, the devas and the other beings, they can also witness these things. So we don't want to be considered foolish. And we hopefully have the protectors of Hiri and Ottappa kick in, and to know, even with fear of wrongdoing, that what the Buddha says in the Duccaritavipāka Sutta is that it's conducive to the lower realms, that if one is reborn as a human, then at a minimum it conduces to false accusations, which is something that none of us would be happy about. It's a cause of much suffering. And so these are also things that are helpful to reflect upon, and to also again remember that it's a blessing. It's associated with happiness if we restrain from lying or false speech, and we remain on the wholesome path. So again, just like the other two that we went through, there are many troubles that come with false speech. And so what we want to do is to abstain and really follow a path that is free of all these troubles. So let's do another short meditation to take this Dhamma into our minds. So again, we look at that truthful speech is the support to abandon false speech. And again, we need to check by also understanding in the past we have lied before to come into this present birth. and to acknowledge that. And so in this present life, we need to look at examples in the conventional sense to begin with, that have we lied to get a job? Have we lied about our qualifications in certain instances, thinking it's okay? Have we lied as part of our job, certain professions such as politics, law, all kinds of things, even advertising? There's certain amount of things that come up with that, even HR. So also to remember that if we tell white lies to relatives or friends to avoid telling the truth, that's also not something that is condoned by the Buddha. And also to know lying in order to do something that we're not supposed to do. So you remember when we're young, maybe we thought it was okay to lie to our parents about where we were going or what we were doing. And imagine if we were found out, or maybe we were found out and had to receive punishments for that. And then also lying to deceive others to gain something. So there are a number of examples there. You would have your own. But the important thing is to also admit the transgression, to see it, to see that this kind of behavior blocks the Noble Eightfold Path. It blocks us from developing this bhavita sila, the good virtue. And in all these different ways of blaming ourselves, being censured by the wise, expecting an outcome that could be a bad destination, all these things help us to come to the noble path, that we want to be blameless, we want to be praised by the wise, we want to end up with a good destination without any troubles or distress, or to penetrate higher. So let's do this meditation again, just for a few minutes, to take this Dhamma into our minds. Blessings of the Triple Gem. We can now come out of that meditation. Let's now look at the fourth thing. The Buddha says, with the support of non-divisive speech, the divisive speech is to be abandoned. So it was said, and with reference to what was this said, here a noble disciple considers thus, I am practicing the way to the abandoning and cutting off of those fetters because of which I might have divisive speech. If I were to have divisive speech, I would blame myself for doing so. The wise, having investigated, would censure me for doing so. And on the dissolution of the body after death because of divisive speech, an unhappy destination would be expected. But this divisive speech is itself a fetter and a hindrance, and while taints, vexation and fever might arise through the divisive speech, there are no taints, vexation and fever for one who abstains from divisive speech. So it was with reference to this that it was said, with the support of non-divisive speech is to be abandoned. So what is the Buddha teaching us here? He's saying that we are practicing the Noble Eightfold Path and we wish to abstain from divisive speech or malicious speech or slander. And this is because it's unwholesome verbal action. And we know that non-divisive speech is part of Āriyakanta Sila, virtues dear to the noble ones. So when we establish this right view, then right intention follows, because we would say we don't want to have non-ill will thinking because it's rooted in non-hate. And so we give up divisive speech, which is rooted in hate. So in this way, we can develop leading to noble retirement. Now, if we have divisive speech, we can't do that because it is rooted in the wrong speech, and non-divisive speech is associated with the right one, and it develops virtue. So together with truthful speech and this non-divisive speech, we are developing virtue, bhavita sila. So divisive speech in the conventional sense is speech that creates disunity or discord. It's where people and groups may be living in harmony or unity, and what results from divisive speech is division or separation or disunity. And so this is also associated, if you remember the Ādhipateyya Sutta, with the mental defilement or mental stain of disparaging or divisiveness, which is palasa in Pali. We need to make sure that we don't have this level of unwholesome verbal conduct, that we don't want to be divisive, we don't want to separate people, we don't want to be slanderous or malicious. And rather, the speech that we want to cultivate is harmonizing, unifying. And so this is the reason why Buddha says that we would blame ourselves, we would be censured by the wise, and that we would expect an unhappy destination. Because if you think about it, when we practice divisive speech, we start to know the pain of causing separation and discord. Like if we say something to friends and we see the pain and suffering in that, or we might fear being blamed or fear being ostracized as a result of divisive speech. And what flows on from there is mental affliction because of that divisive speech. The wise, of course, would censure us, although today's modern world is imbued with divisive speech and people don't seem to clue in that it's so bad. So, but at least we know that the devas and the people that are practicing this noble path would actually censure us and consider us foolish to keep doing these things. And then after death, an unhappy destination could be expected. So Duccaritavipāka Sutta tells us that it's conducive to lower realms to have divisive speech, but also if one is reborn as a human, then at a minimum it conduces to being divided from one's friends. So that's also very good to consider, because when you think sometimes, why are relationships always broken, or why can't I find a good partner, or why am I always on the outside of family, it could be due to certain karma as well. It's not always directly like that, but there is something in there. So it's helpful to reflect in this way because it helps us to restrain, and then there's happiness associated with restraint. And then of course we understand there are so many troubles that come up as a result of divisive speech, and so we don't want those kinds of afflictions, and so that's why we choose to abstain, that we don't want any of these troubles, we don't want to be bound to an unhappy destination. So let's do another short meditation to take this Dhamma into our minds. So we are using non-divisive speech, so harmonizing speech, as a support to abandon divisive speech. So we need to check about examples. So think about, have we encouraged friends to break up with their partners? Have we spoken divisively at work about a colleague or a manager? Have we given an impassioned political speech imbued with divisiveness towards different parties or people? Have we, due to issues within a family, that we've been divisive in terms of how we speak with other family members about the family members we have problems with, and it's created discord? Have we had divisive speech amongst friends according to our bias, according to our preference? So if we find examples like that, then we go through what the Buddha has said about the pain and suffering associated with that, being blamed for certain things, being censured by the wise, and not wanting to expect an unhappy destination, and most of all, that we don't want to be blocked from this Noble Eightfold Path. So we make, when we genuinely see that, we make this strong determination. Let me not have this divisive speech. Let me cultivate non-divisive speech and abandon the divisive speech to walk this path. And so we're developing more virtue as a result of that. We're blameless. The wise would praise us, and we can expect a better outcome. So let's do this meditation again, just for a few minutes. Okay, blessings of the Triple Gem. We can come out of our meditation. Let's now look at the fifth thing. The Buddha says, with the support of no greed and covetousness is to be abandoned. So it was said, with reference to what was this said. And Here a noble disciple considers thus, I am practicing the way to the abandoning and cutting off of those fetters because of which I might have greed and covetousness. If I were to have greed and covetousness, I would blame myself for doing so. The wise, having investigated, would censure me for doing so. And on the dissolution of the body after death, because of greed and covetousness, an unhappy destination would be expected. But this greed and covetousness is itself a fetter and a hindrance. And while taints, vexation, and fever might arise through greed and covetousness, there are no taints, vexation, and fever for one who abstains from greed and covetousness. So it is with reference to this that it was said, with the support of no greed and covetousness is to be abandoned. So what is the Buddha teaching us here? To practice the Noble Eightfold Path, we wish to abstain from greed and covetousness because it is an unwholesome mental action. So the Noble Eightfold Path leads with right view, and if we want to establish right intention to align with right view, we need to have thoughts of renunciation because it's rooted in non-greed. So we would abandon greed and covetousness because that's rooted in greed, and so non-greed replaces greed. So we can develop the Noble Eightfold Path if we do this. Now, having no greed and covetousness, what this is associated with is development of the mind, bhavita citta. So greed and covetousness is associated with many mental defilements, like you think about abhijja, covetousness, all that wanting and longing. And so this is almost like doubly so. So we need to ensure that we don't cultivate this kind of mental action, and it is quite difficult living in proximity with sensuality. But when you think about no greed and covetousness, then we are very much leaning towards renunciation and being happy with what we have, being happy with simplicity, contentment. And of course, as a result of that, we're easy to support. And so when you look at what the Buddha has said, similar to the other ones, we need to look at blaming ourselves, the wise censuring us, and an unhappy destination. So when it's greed and covetousness, there's a lot of pain associated with longing and excessive wanting. And when you think about when we've looked at this as a mental defilement in terms of even covetousness, there is a lot that says that people don't like being around greedy people. It's sometimes hard to believe, but when you're on the spiritual path, it's not a quality that is conducive to good friendship. And mental defilements escalate as a result of wanting more. And the wise would censure. This is again similar to devas and things like that, also censuring, as would somebody with right view. And when it comes to an unhappy destination, then it's good to know the consequences of our actions, that we're the owners and heirs. And so if we are excessively greedy and we can't let go of sensual pleasures, then most of what the Buddha says in the suttas is that we can expect an unhappy destination. So fear of wrongdoing helps us in this respect, as does moral shame. So it's good to restrain, as we've said, and to not allow all these troubles to come and vex us, to come and disturb us from the path. And to know that if we abstain, then we are free of these troubles and we wouldn't expect an unhappy destination at the point of death. So let's do another short meditation. Here, again, we're using no greed and covetousness as the support to abandon greed and covetousness. We need to look at examples. So maybe it's simply looking through a magazine and becoming enticed with what is there. And where we see somebody has a nice car and we want it as well. Or wanting a bigger share of our sibling in terms of what they have been given by our parents. So in terms of inheritance, wanting more than our share. Or yearning to win the lottery, or greedy for a big profit from share portfolio or other investments, or longing for the latest gadget. Whatever the example is that one has, just take one of your own examples and really look at that to see that it blocks the Noble Eightfold Path, that it prevents us from this bhavita citta, the development of mind that is needed for this path, and our mental defilements will grow. And so if you look at it in all these different ways, then we make this strong determination to give up greed and covetousness, to actually develop non-greed or no greed and covetousness. And by doing so, we would be blameless. The wise would praise us, and we could expect a good destination or to develop further. So let's do this meditation for another few minutes. Blessings of the Triple Gem. We can come out of our meditation. Let's now look at the sixth thing. The Buddha says, with the support of not insulting with anger, the insulting with anger is to be abandoned. So it was said, and with reference to what was this said. Here a noble disciple considers thus: I am practicing the way to the abandoning and cutting off of those fetters, because of which I might have insulting with anger. If I were to have insulting with anger, I would blame myself for doing so. The wise, having investigated, would censure me for doing so, and on the dissolution of the body after death, because of insulting with anger, an unhappy destination would be expected. But this insulting with anger is itself a fetter and a hindrance, and while taints, vexation, and fever might arise through the insulting with anger, there are no taints, vexation, and fever for one who abstains from insulting with anger. And so it is with reference to this that it was said, with the support of not insulting with anger, the insulting with anger is to be abandoned. So what is the Buddha teaching us here? He's saying we are practicing the Noble Eightfold Path and we wish to abstain from insulting with anger because it's an unwholesome mental action. So when we establish the right view for the Noble Eightfold Path, and we have thoughts of renunciation, thoughts of non-ill will, and thoughts of harmlessness. So these things are rooted in non-greed, non-hatred, and non-delusion. So we have the right intention when it comes to not insulting with anger. Then it is possible for us to abandon insulting with anger because it's rooted in all three. It's rooted in greed, hatred, and delusion. So we can't develop the Noble Eightfold Path. We're blocked if we insult with anger. And by not insulting with anger, this is associated with fulfilling the development of the mind. So when we have no greed and covetousness, and we cultivate not insulting with anger, we fulfill this development of mind, bhavita citta. So again, we do a very similar thing. We would blame ourselves. So when it comes to insulting with anger, there is a kind of remorse that can arise if it kicks in, like some kind of moral shame that kicks in. Because when we insult with anger, there's fear of being exposed or being shamed in public for the truth to come out. And mental defilements, of course, escalate when this happens, and it causes more suffering. The wise would certainly censure us, particularly those with right view, and also those in the higher realms would also observe and call us foolish. And when we have right view, we also know that the Buddha says that an unhappy destination can be expected because we are the owners of our karma, heirs to our karma. So these are all, again, very helpful things for us to contemplate and to restrain as a result of really taking those things to heart. And again, also lots of troubles come our way when it comes to insulting with anger. And so we don't want to become fettered to such unwholesome actions. We don't want to be bound for misery or distress, whether it's in this lifetime or beyond. And so when we think about this way, when we abstain from insulting with anger, then we can expect a happy destination, or further if we have penetrated more Dhamma, and we won't experience troubles and distress in this way. So let's do another short meditation. In this particular instance, the examples one would look at is if we drive an expensive car and we show it off and we pretend that, it's all good, but then the bank is just about to repossess it, come to our job and take it away. Likewise, if we buy a really fancy house and we've borrowed money from the bank for it, and a bailiff actually comes to seize possession of it because we've defaulted on our payments. Or when we flaunt a luxury lifestyle on social media only for people to find out that it's fake. Or when we decorate the body with a lot of expensive jewelry that we've borrowed and it's to cover up aging. Or even when someone is young and dressed provocatively, showing a lot of skin and flaunting youth and beauty, maybe in the faces of the older generation or to people or groups who are less attractive, and not realizing that really they're also subject to aging, sickness and death. So these are some examples of how we can insult with anger. It's out of, greed, hatred, and delusion that it actually kicks in. And so when you see it, that you see it's very foolish to do this, that sensual pleasures are fleeting anyway, including this body, then it's really good to make amends and admit the transgression, and to also contemplate what we just went through before about blaming ourselves and being censured by the wise, expecting an unhappy destination, and most of all, blocking this Noble Eightfold Path. And so make that very strong determination in the meditation when you see it, that we don't want to insult with anger. We want to practice and develop this Noble Eightfold Path and abandon insulting with anger. And so we develop this bhavita citta as a result of it. We would be blameless, the wise would praise us, and we can expect a good outcome. Let's do this meditation for another few minutes. Blessings of the Triple Gem. we can come out of our meditation. So just before we go on to the seventh thing, is just to say this is very powerful stuff, because we don't often contemplate in this way so consciously. So the fact that we are consciously cultivating this right now, which is we can only ever meditate right now. And if one were to, by the end of even this meditation, and something were to happen, the mind is in such a good place. It is actually with the Noble Eightfold Path. And so much has actually been given as part of doing the meditations up to this point. So this is very, very good. So let's now look at the seventh thing, which is the non-affliction with anger. And the Buddha says, with the support of non-affliction with anger, affliction with anger is to be abandoned. So it was said. And with reference to what was this said? Here a noble disciple considers thus, I am practicing the way to the abandoning and cutting off of those fetters, because of which I might have affliction with anger. If I were to have affliction with anger, I would blame myself for doing so. The wise, having investigated, would censure me for doing so, and on the dissolution of the body after death because of affliction with anger, an unhappy destination would be expected. With this affliction with anger, but this affliction with anger is itself a fetter and a hindrance, and while taints, vexation, and fever might arise through affliction with anger, there are no taints, vexation, and fever for one who abstains from affliction with anger. So it is with reference to this that it was said, with the support of no affliction with anger is to be abandoned. So to practice the Noble Eightfold Path, we need to abstain from affliction with anger, because it's an unwholesome mental action. Now, the Noble Eightfold Path, as we keep saying, we establish the right view, so we know it's unwholesome. So right intention needs to follow, which means we have non-ill will thinking. So this is rooted in non-hate. And with that, we abandon anger, affliction with anger, which is rooted in hatred. So we are blocked from the Noble Eightfold Path if we keep being afflicted with anger. And by cultivating this non-affliction with anger, we develop wisdom. So this is the bhavita panya. Now, the Buddha says the same sequence again, that we would blame ourselves, the wise would censure us, and after death an unhappy destination would be expected. This one is really, when you look at this affliction with anger, it's really seeing our predicament. We can't help but be afflicted with anger if we really look at how sad we are each and every time we're faced with aging, sickness, and death, with things that keep breaking, whatever we try to lift in the world, whether it's working, whether it's with our families and loved ones, whatever it may be. The set of circumstances that we're all dealt with can only mean that when we are meeting these things, the breaking of our constructions, that we think it can last, that we think we are in control, that we end up afflicted with anger. So it's part and parcel of having birthed this kind of body into the sensual world. So again, we look at having some remorse over not understanding things and getting angry as a result, more so than we need to if we have acceptance and understanding that we have this wisdom developed. And likewise, the wise would censure us if we continue to just keep developing and breeding anger, not understanding properly. And an unhappy destination, the Buddha says, can be expected, because when you're afflicted with anger, these are unwholesome mental actions. And so the Buddha is saying there are consequences. Now, the Cūḷaniddesa Sutta, which is Majjhima Nikaya Discourse number 135, it actually talks about the consequences of actions for someone who is angry and irritable. And because of performing or undertaking these kinds of mental actions, then an unhappy destination can be expected, so lower realms. And if one comes back to the human state, then the Buddha says they are reborn, but they are ugly. So these are also things that we can reflect. So it's good to restrain as much as possible, but because it's a wisdom path, we have to come to an understanding about these contemplations, such as the 5 subjects for frequent contemplation. If one really sees the First Noble Truth of suffering, then it's easier to come to this non-affliction with anger from proper understanding, proper wisdom. And so we would be less troubled as a result of cultivating this non-anger. And of course, we would be bound for a more happy destination unless we progress further and experience less troubles and distress. So the way to do this meditation is really to take examples where we are afflicted with anger and to really look at it. So there's so many. It's like what arises when we lose our job, because this is breaking of our construction. Like anger when we have to go through a divorce or a separation from a partner. The anger which arises when we're told off by somebody, whether it's at work or within our family. Or anger when we're ghosted by friends and they don't have time for us. Anger when our children choose to live abroad because the work is there or for whatever reason and they can't come and visit us, or they have little time. Or anger when we lose part or all of our wealth or property. Anger when we age and people no longer look at us with interest. Anger when we're diagnosed with a terminal illness. Anger when a loved one passes away. These are things that are, if we really understand correctly, we can understand why these things happen. If we understand this magnitude of samsara, our predicament in the world, then it doesn't have to be that we're afflicted with anger. And so if we have been afflicted with anger in the past in the wrong way, then it's good to admit that, to see that, oh, now I have more understanding about this predicament, this bigger predicament, and I actually have more acceptance and understanding through our contemplations. And so therefore, I don't want to blame myself. I don't want to be censured by the wise. I don't want to be bound to an unhappy destination for breeding anger in the wrong way. And so when we see this with wisdom and proper understanding, then there's something really powerful in this. And that's where we make that strong determination for non-affliction with anger, and that we can practice this Noble Eightfold Path and abandon affliction with anger. And so this is how we start developing bhavatapanya, that non-association with anger helps us to develop wisdom. And so we would be blameless, the wise would praise us, and we would have less troubles and expect a better outcome. So let's do this meditation for a few minutes, and then we'll cover the last one. Okay, blessings of the Triple Gem. Okay, we can come out of the meditation. Let's now look at the eighth and last thing, which is about non-arrogance. And the Buddha says, with the support of non-arrogance, the arrogance is to be abandoned. So it was said. And with reference to what was this said, here a noble disciple considers thus, I am practicing the way to the abandoning and cutting off of those fetters because of which I might have arrogance. If I were to have arrogance, I would blame myself for doing so. The wise, having investigated, would censure me for doing so. And on the dissolution of the body after death, because of arrogance, an unhappy destination would be expected. But this arrogance is itself a fetter and a hindrance, and while taints, vexation, and fever might arise through the arrogance, there are no taints, vexation, and fever for one who abstains from arrogance. So it is with reference to this that it was said, with the support of non-arrogance, the arrogance is to be abandoned. So we are practicing the Noble Eightfold Path, and we wish to abstain from arrogance, which is an unwholesome mental action. And as we said at the very, very beginning, arrogance or conceit is driving these other kinds of misconduct, and misconduct in turn breeds more arrogance or conceit. So to establish or develop the Noble Eightfold Path, we establish right view. And if we have that, then we have thoughts of non-ill will and non-harm as part of our right intention, because it's rooted in non-hate and non-delusion. And so we want to abandon arrogance, which is rooted in hatred and delusion. Now, we can't develop the Noble Eightfold Path if we are arrogant. So non-arrogance helps us to complete this bhavita panya, that we're developing wisdom as part of the Noble Eightfold Path. So again, the Buddha reminds us about blaming ourselves, that the wise would censure us, and that we could expect an unhappy destination. We want moral shame and fear of wrongdoing to kick in. Again, in the Cūḷaniddesa Sutta, the Buddha talks about if a person is obstinate or arrogant, and because of performing those actions, then at the point of death, they would reappear in lower realms or an unhappy destination. So if one comes back to a human state, the Buddha says, one would be reborn and they are low-born. And so it's really good to use these different things to help us to actually walk the path, the noble path, and to prevent us from any of these unwholesome mental actions, particularly this arrogance. And when we look at all the troubles that are associated with being arrogant and how people would view the arrogance as well, it's also something that we would think, let me abstain, because this doesn't align with the spiritual path. So if we are to do another short meditation, our last one for today, and what we need to remember, non-arrogance is the support for abandoning arrogance. So we need to think about all the things that makes us feel superior about maybe our family that we're born into, arrogant about our studies and qualifications and job, arrogant about our misconduct, so all the other 7 things that we went through, or even the arrogance believing that there is no consequences for our actions. So it's really good to look at something that is your own example and really see that this is going to prevent, this is a transgression, and it's going to prevent from developing this Noble Eightfold Path. And this is what is needed towards noble retirement. So I don't want to blame myself. I don't want to be censured by the wise. I don't want to expect an unhappy destination. And so from this is where the strong determination comes in. And it's a genuine one, that we want to develop wisdom for this path. And so if we do so by cultivating non-arrogance, then we are blameless. The praise would come from the wise, and we would be free of troubles. So let's do this meditation, our last one, just for a few minutes, and then we'll summarize. Okay, blessings of the Triple Gem. we can come out of our meditation. So we've now examined the Buddha's words on these 8 things that lead to noble retirement. So really what helps us to develop the Noble Eightfold Path, and meditated on each of them together. What is inspiring is knowing that this powerful teaching has been given to a householder, to a layperson, someone already leaning towards renunciation. It confirms that noble retirement is not simply a lifestyle change or giving away wealth. It confirms that we need to consciously develop wholesome, skillful physical, verbal, and mental actions, as they are essential towards generating the noble path. And we must abandon misconduct by body, speech, and mind. Otherwise, we're blocked from the noble path and continuing to remain cultivating the wrong path that binds us to samsara. So the overall encouragement from today's session is to make effort to genuinely connect with these 8 things and develop them as the Buddha has taught. Right now, we are probably very much with the Noble Eightfold Path, having done these short meditations, making the determination right now in our meditation. From this place, we can even, after this session, if you like to continue meditating, is to spread loving kindness, because essentially the physical, verbal, and mental actions have been corrected. So if we're able to generate this Noble Eightfold Path, we're getting closer to noble retirement and the true safety and happiness of nibbāna. So we've now come to the end of this first session on the Potaliya Sutta. What we've contemplated today is very useful, and it's also very useful in the sense of being able to gradually train, gradually make progress. Tomorrow's session will use some of what we have meditated on today, contemplated today, and take it a notch higher. In fact, it's actually something that isn't easily digestible just in one sitting. And so it's good to break it up and to know that even tomorrow's session is not the end of one's training in the Potaliya Sutta. There are actually some very deep dhammas that are presented by the Buddha to Potaliya, to a householder. So in our minds, let's now express gratitude to the Buddha for these powerful teachings. Let's also express gratitude to our teachers, our parents, our good friends, and those who encourage us on the Noble Eightfold Path. And if you would like to dedicate merit from joining this Dhamma session to any departed relatives, you can do so now. And we can now share the merits for our wholesome time together with all sentient beings. May all beings be happy and well. May all beings be free from suffering. Blessings of the Triple Gem to all of you. Wishing you all well. May you continue to find happiness in the Buddha's teachings, develop the Noble Eightfold Path, and grow in wholesome qualities.